All right, good morning, everybody. Thank you all for coming. Thanks to all of you who are in the course that are usually in this room, and to those of you who have come from the various corners of our university to see this lecture. We have two speakers today. Our main speaker, Dr. Anjuman-i Asār. He is the Prophet Muhammad professor, or visiting professor of Shia Islam Studies at the Jaffer Center for Muslim World Studies, which is the center within SIPA, in which several of us work. And he is going to speak on this very, very interesting scholar, Toshihiko Izutsu, who is a scholar of comparative religions, but specifically focusing on the study of Islam in comparison with other traditions. And those of you who are in my course you haven't had a full lesson on Islam yet, but you have enough of a background in the other religions to maybe be interested in this comparison. And for the last portion of today, we are going to have comments and questions and responses offered by Dr. Īmān, a colleague in the Department of Religious Studies and the director of the Asian Studies program as well. So we have a pretty interesting topic and speakers who are very interested in this as well. They're very qualified to speak on it. So I hope you guys just pay attention and offer, whatever comments and questions you'll have. We'll have time for that at the end. Okay, thank you.
Very well, my topic is Toshihiko Izutsu and Islam as viewed from Japan, specifically through the lens of Professor Izutsu. However, my esteemed colleague, Dr. Carlos Renier, has asked me to, before I enter into the body of my lecture, to devote a few moments, starting now, to Islam in general, Islam as such. What is Islam? The term Islam is an Arabic word. It comes from the verb aslama yuslimu, which means to submit. It is derived from an Arabic triliteral root, which means peace. Submission in the sense of the complete submission of the human being to the will of the one and only God, who is known by the Arabic word in Islam, Allah, which simply means the God. What, in terms of a religion, is Islam? What is religion as such? Unfortunately, in the modern world, people do not give proper definitions. They just talk using words, and in the scholarly context, definitions are very, very important. So Islam is a religion, but what do I mean by a religion? By religion, I mean a universal human phenomenon characterized by the following three things. One, a metaphysical doctrine, a teaching on the nature of the ultimate truth or the ultimately real. Second, it is characterized by a method of concentration or devotion, if you prefer theological language, to the aforementioned supreme ultimate metaphysical principle. And third, it has some kind of teaching on the cultivation of or the practice of the virtues. This, in my view, is what a religion is. And Islam, the fundamental metaphysical doctrine of Islam is that there is nothing truly that exists except the ultimate reality, or God, the Arabic word being Allah, the more metaphysical term in Arabic being al-haq, the ultimate truth. The supreme ultimate. So a Muslim must believe in Allah. He must affirm that he believes in Allah and that there is none worthy of worship but Allah. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah, as we say in Arabic. I bear witness that there is no entity worthy of worship but Allah. Moreover, this religion has a prophet, a person who embodies and personifies the teaching. That is none other than the Prophet Muhammad, upon whom be peace, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. And he brings a divine scripture, a revelation which is revealed to him by the angel Gabriel, which is called the Qur'an. Qur'an in Arabic means the recitation. He's usually characterized as al-Qur'an al-Majid in Arabic, the glorious recitation, or al-Qur'an al-Kareem, the noble reading, the noble recitation. Very well. Who is a Muslim? Well, a Muslim is one who affirms these two principles, that there is no God but God, and that Muhammad is the messenger of God. Moreover, he is the last messenger of God. Furthermore, every Muslim does a bunch of things. One of these important things, and in this order, after the affirmation of these truths, after the affirmation of these doctrines and beliefs, is prayer 5 times a day, fasting once a year in a month called Ramadan, which follows a lunar, Muslims follow a lunar calendar, a certain amount of wealth which is given to the poor every year, which is about 1/40 or 2.5% on certain kinds of earning and property. Finally, there is the pilgrimage to Mecca once in one's lifetime if one is able. This is Islam. 3 minutes. The study of Islam, now going into Izutsu, the study of Islam in the West was a phenomenon which arose in Europe. And it emerges in the context, on the one hand, of biblical studies at the hands of Jewish and Christian scholars who were often clergymen, rabbis, or the equivalent in whatever Christian denomination. And on the other hand, in the context of the Western colonial project, whether it was British or Dutch or French, or even Russian if you consider Russia part of the West. As such, the study of Islam as it emerged in medieval Europe was marred by certain, I would say, biases. And because the people who came to the study of Islam typically came out of biblical studies, and most of them were either Jewish or Christian, in that case they were almost all Protestant, they approached the study of Islam and Islamic texts from the point of view of what was at the time coming into prominence and became known as the higher criticism or the textual criticism of the Bible. The Bible being, of course, a collection of texts in Hebrew, a tiny portion in Aramaic, and the rest in Greek, typically referred to by Christians as the Old Testament and the New Testament. Of course, the Jews don't call it the Old Testament because for them it's not old, they don't believe in the New Covenant, and it's typically referred to in English as the Hebrew Bible or by the Hebrew acronym Tanakh. So these scholars of biblical studies were very much interested in textual criticism, and they applied the same methods to the study of Islam. A famous name in this regard is the German scholar Julius Wellhausen, or Julius Wellhausen. And he is very famous for his studies of the textual transmission of the Hebrew Bible, specifically the Torah, the first 5 books of Moses, or what is also known as the Pentateuch, the Chumash in Hebrew. And he applied the same approach to the study of Islam, particularly Islamic history, and he wrote a book on Islamic history entitled Das Arabische Reich und sein Sturz, which is the Arab kingdom and its fall. It was very much concerned with Islamic history. And there were other figures. There was a Jewish individual who had a very thorough rabbinical training. He was a Hungarian Jew. His name was Ignaz Goldziher. And he also devoted himself to the study of Islamic texts outside of the Qur'an. Then there was a scholar in Germany, also he was not Jewish. His name was Theodor Nöldecki. He applied himself to the study of the Qur'an. So these guys were very much interested in philological work, based on, in other words, a command of the languages, primarily Arabic, but there are others, but Arabic is the most important language of Islam because the Qur'an is in Arabic. The important texts are in Arabic. There was also a theological current among these early studies, which, because of the historicist orientation of these scholars, sought to find the origins of Islam in Judaism and Christianity. And this was very much a favorite pastime of these early scholars of Islam, and continues to be the favorite pastime of certain people who continue in their study of Islam today. People like Michael Cook at Princeton, although he's kind of moved away from that. But there are many, such as John Wansborough, he's now deceased, Patricia Catrone. Patricia Crone is also deceased. Fred Donner, he is not deceased, University of Chicago. These are the major and minor prophets, shall we say, of the cult of Orientalism. And so they had a particular approach to the study of Islam. Islam either as just a mine of texts to be subjected to philological investigation, and again, Islam as a bunch of sources and texts whose origin was to be found in either the Hebrew Bible, the New Testament, and homiletic works, Talmudic lore, Haggadic or Gadic works, basically sources in Judaism and Jewish and Christian sources. When we come to the study of Islamic philosophy in the West, we have a similar state of affairs. And in this context, there were people who had a training in philosophy. In those days, in the 19th century, throughout the 19th century, in the early part of the 20th century, people still received a genuine education before they came to university. And they had, in the Western world, they would have mastered Latin and Greek and various other very important liberal arts, especially logic and grammar. And if they had studied philosophy, they would have had a thorough grounding in Aristotle and Plato, and maybe Plotinus. So when these individuals came to the study of philosophy, they were quite astonished to find philosophical texts in the Arabic language. Versions of Aristotle in Arabic, versions of Plato, versions of Plotinus, fragments of other ancient sages of Hellas, the great philosophers of ancient Greece. But they looked upon Islamic philosophy as merely a kind of Hamzatul Wasl, or a kind, in Arabic we would say, a kind of middleman, if you like, between the ancients, namely the ancient Greeks, and medieval Europe. Because these sources had been more or less lost or neglected, and through translations which took place mainly in Spain from Arabic into Latin, there was a rediscovery, as it were, of Aristotle in particular. And anyway, the story is a long one and it continues in Europe. My point is that Islamic philosophy typically was not treated as philosophy as such. It wasn't given the dignity of an actual philosophy worth considering. And the study of Islamic philosophy was merely seen as a kind of antiquarian concern or pursuit. In other words, they were basically just interested in the history of the transmission of philosophy to the West, where the real story continued. Part of the reason they came to this sort of conclusion was there was a very widespread idea until, and I kid you not, until the middle of the 20th century, in fact the second half of the 20th century, the 60s onward, that held that philosophy in the Islamic world died out approximately the year 1111 of the Christian calendar, easy to remember, or 505 of the Hijrah, which coincides with the death of a person named al-Ghazali. Al-Ghazali was a Muslim legal scholar, theologian, and arch critic of philosophy, and he wrote a book which was rather influential, known as Tahafut al-Falasifa in Arabic, or The Refutation of Philosophy. In the generation immediately following al-Ghazali, a refutation of his refutation, entitled Tahafut at-Tahafut, was written in Muslim Spain by a jurist and philosopher and physician from Cordoba in Arabic, named Ibn Rushd. And Western scholars thought that was it, that's the end of the story, and so they really weren't too interested after that. The fact is that Islamic philosophy continued, and it was very closely related in ensuing centuries. So after the death of al-Ghazali, within about 505, so within about a century and a half, you have a striking efflorescence of another phenomenon known as Sufism. The inner esoteric dimension of Islam, which some people refer to as the mystical dimension of Islam. I have certain reservations about the use of this term, which are beyond the scope of this lecture. And the most metaphysically minded, if we may use this turn of phrase, Sufi in the history of Sufism is another Spanish figure by the name of Muhyiddin ibn al-Arabi, or just Ibn Arabi for short. And he espoused a teaching which is central to our story of Izutsu. And that was the teaching that the meaning of La ilaha illallah, or that there is no God but Allah, or that there is none worthy of worship but Allah, is that nothing truly exists, ontologically speaking, except God, except Allah. This doctrine became known as wahdatul wujūd, or what is typically translated as oneness of being, or the unity of being, or the unicity is maybe better, of being. You may also replace the word being with existence. Now, Ibn al-Arabi, in all likelihood, never used this exact term, but he used things close to it. But this exact term was introduced by his disciples and followers who came in the generation immediately after him. And they produced a very philosophically rigorous elaboration of this quote-unquote mystical doctrine, which was heavily imbued with the philosophical terminology of a person who lived about more than 2 centuries before the flourishing of Ibn al-Arabi, who was in the 600s of the Islamic calendar, the 1200s of the 13th century, and that was Avicenna, or Ibn Sina. And so they expressed and elaborated this highly recondite doctrine in a very rigorous Avicennan or Ibn Sinaian language and format. And it has further elaborations in the course of the history of Islam. And so this was the sort of nexus between philosophy and so-called mysticism. And all of this continued in the Sunni world for a while, but not in the form of philosophy as such. It was sort of mixed with these kind of mystical doctrines as well as theological doctrines, and it mainly thrived in the eastern lands of Islam. With the passage of time, many of the peoples who lived in those eastern lands of Islam became Shia Muslims. And Islamic philosophy, in any genuine sense, today truly only exists in Shia circles, especially in Iran. Shia Muslims are not found just in Iran. They're also found in Azerbaijan. That's a place where they speak a version of Turkish. They're found in the Arab world in large numbers in Lebanon and in Iraq and other kinds of Shias in Yemen. There are lots of Shias in South Asia, Pakistan, India, Afghanistan. So it's not an exclusively Iranian thing. But the centers of Shia religious studies are now more or less in Iraq and in Iran, and it is really in Iran where the study and teaching of philosophy thrives in Shia seminaries. All right, so this is all necessary background, so now we come to Izutsu. Izutsu was a linguist by training. Not only was he a linguist, he was a linguistic prodigy. By the time he died, he had mastered 34 languages. And I don't mean he was studying until the day before he died to learn those 34. He learned them at an early age, and by the time he was in his late 20s, he was already teaching Russian literature at a Japanese university. I don't recall which one. He was a master of Arabic, Persian, Sanskrit, Pali, Hindustani. And Japanese is not one of the languages that I know, but I have colleagues who have informed me that many of the key early textbooks that were written for learning these languages were authored by none other than Toshihiko Izutsu. To get an idea of his mastery of the Arabic language, you should know that he is the first person to produce a genuine translation of the Qur'an directly from the original Arabic. Directly from the original Arabic. It's in 3 small volumes. Someone gave it to me as a gift, but I can't read it. It's a nice little artifact, though, in my library. To get a better idea of Izutsu's orientation in his studies of Islam, he also authored a very important work called The Structure of Ethical Terms in the Qur'an. If that were not enough, he has another study of the Qur'an entitled God and Man in the Qur'an, the Semantics of the Qur'anic Weltanschauung, fancy German word, worldview, something like that. So he's a very serious scholar in terms of his mastery of the languages. And he eventually ended up in Iran at something which at the time was called the Imperial Iranian Academy of Philosophy. And there he was close to people like Sayyid Hussein Nasr, as well as Mahdi Muhaqqiq, Sayyid Jalaluddin and Sayyid Jalaluddin Ashtiani. These are huge, huge names in the firmament of the study of Islamic philosophy. He was also associated with a yearly gathering which would take place in Switzerland, a place called Ascana, Switzerland, I think. And these conferences were called the Eranos conferences. And many famous scholars of religion and other subjects would attend these. Izutsu was one of them. Another one was the great French scholar of Islam, particularly of Shia Islam, Henri Corbin, the French scholar who studied with Louis Massignon. Other people who graced those conferences were the famous Jewish scholar of the Kabbalah, or the Kabbalah if you prefer, namely Gershom Scholem. Another big name that attended those was Carl Jung. Some people mispronounce it as Carl Jung, but it's German, so the J is a ya sound. Who else? Those are the big names. I mean, Joseph Campbell would edit the papers. If you've heard of Joseph Campbell, the power of myth and so on and so forth. So Izutsu was moving in these circles. And Izutsu became very interested through his studies of not only Islam, but what he called oriental philosophies, in the plural. In other words, the kind of thought which he treated as philosophy that you find in Japan, such as that which is associated with a form of Buddhism which has, for better or worse, become synonymous with Japanese religion, namely Zen. Izutsu came from such a background. I'm not sure which school his father adhered to, whether it was, anyway, let's not go in. He was involved in some sort of Zen. And his father, he tells the story himself, made him sit in Zen meditation, what is called Zazen, the seated meditation, lotus posture, you count breaths. And Izutsu talks about how he really did not like doing that, and how much he hated that experience. And so he wanted to study something completely far away from Zen, and so he started learning languages. And then later, as an older man, he talks about how he really came full circle, and he came back to the study of Zen. So a lot of the papers that he read in Switzerland had something or the other to do with Japanese Zen Buddhism, or, I remember I said Oriental philosophies, Oriental meaning East, Taoism, especially the texts of the Dao De Jing by Lao Tzu, and the Chuangzi by Chuangzi, and the Yi Jing by no one knows, anonymous. And he was also very interested in Indic religions, particularly the Vedant or the Vedanta, especially the texts known as the the Upanishads. And he read them in the original. So to give you an example, if Izutsu is talking about the Heart Sutra, he can consult the original Sanskrit, he can read the Chinese versions, he can read the Japanese, we probably knew it by heart. A lot of Japanese sects recite the Heart Sutra. So this was his background, his sophistication, and he became interested in something called oriental philosophy in general. And he believed it had a unique structure. And he related that to his study of Islam. So he saw the teaching of Ibn al-Arabi, of the unicity of being, as a kind of overarching framework, or what he called a meta-philosophy for the study of oriental philosophies. Now, this notion of meta-philosophy, by this he meant that this doctrine of Ibn Arabi, the unity of being, provided a metaphysical framework which was so universal in application that it could serve as a means of analyzing and unifying the metaphysical traditions of myriad recondite Oriental doctrines, from Vedic to Buddhist to Chinese. This approach is best illustrated in his extensive English language monograph entitled Sufism and Taoism, a Comparative Study of Key Philosophical Concepts, which was published by the University of California Press, Berkeley, 1983. 1983, that was about 15 years after he originally wrote it. It first came out between 1966 and 1967 in 2 volumes, published in Tokyo with more or less the same title. It was published by something called the Keio Institute of Cultural and Linguistic Studies. This book is so significant that there is a very good and complete erudite translation of this work entirely into Persian, and I have a copy, and I bought it at the Tehran Book Fair in May of 2003. And people read these books in Iran. He says on the very first page, by which I mean the page of the foreword or the front matter, Roman numeral I was becoming conscious of myself, gradually getting into a new phase of my intellectual life, writes Toshihiko Izutsu, groping my way towards a new type of Oriental philosophy, based on a series of rigorously philological comparative studies of the key terms of various philosophical traditions in the Near, Middle, and Far East. Significantly, he mentions, more or less in the same place, Professor Henry Corbin's use of the term meta-historical dialogue. So this was the intellectual project of Toshihiko Izutsu. When does this class end? Oh, okay. So let me illustrate this. In the system of Ibn al-Arabi as elaborated by his immediate disciples and successors in a master-to-disciple chain, they spelled out this recondite metaphysical doctrine in a very rigorous philosophical language and advanced a certain ontological scheme which Toshihiko Izutsu adopts as a meta-philosophy, as a meta-language to discuss what he calls Oriental philosophies. So, if we speak about God, God would be the more theological term, the term Allah. Ibn al-Arabi, when he's speaking in a very metaphysical context, but not exclusively, he often uses the term al-haq, or which means the ultimate truth. This is an Arabic term. It's used in the Qur'an. It's not a controversial word. He uses it to introduce this nuance in his writing. And if we use more strictly philosophical language or metaphysical language, we will say that Allah is al-haq, He's the ultimate truth, but He is also al-wujūd, or being with a capital B, or existence with a capital E, inasmuch as nothing truly exists but Allah. Nothing truly exists but Allah. And what we see around us, it is important to note here that the doctrine doesn't say that all of this is an illusion. This is also real. But it is only real because it is in some sense or another a reflection or a manifestation of al-wujūd, pure being. Or if you like, in more theological terms, God or Allah. And that the entire world, which translates the Arabic word al-alam, which is better rendered as the universe or the cosmos, which is what I prefer. And in that sense, cosmos or al-alam is everything other than al-haq or Allah. So the entire cosmos is nothing but the continuous theophany or hierophany of al-haq or of Allah, or of what is called in Arabic al-asma. Al-asma al-husna, the most beautiful names of Allah, or the most beautiful names of God. So each and everything we see is nothing but a locus of manifestation of the ultimately real. And there is an hierarchical gradation of being. And the most fundamental, ontologically speaking, and most logically prior in this schema are three stages of being in terms of manifestation. One is the existence or being in and of itself, in which it is beyond, utterly beyond being conditioned. It is, in other words, utterly non-conditioned and beyond even the condition of being non-conditioned. Then we have God as negatively conditioned, or wujūd as negatively conditioned, what he or she or it is not. Then we have being as being conditioned by something, and this is the phenomenal world. And so Izutsu was very much enamored of this philosophical or this ontological scheme, which I have just outlined in the barest, just barely sketched for you, when we should try and wrap up and get to questions. But to give you some examples, so he saw this as a viable meta-philosophy for oriental philosophies, because he was looking for a terminology, a way for him to study all of these. And he found it, in his view, in the system of Ibn al-Arabi. He was very interested in studying all of these different systems. He has, in fact, a book called Towards the Philosophy of Zen Buddhism, in which he doesn't really talk much about Islam, but it is heavily indebted to his reading of Islamic philosophy. So he talks about how Islamic philosophy is very much indebted to Aristotle. And in Aristotle, we have a fundamental distinction between substance and accident. And so he says that Islamic philosophy is very much Aristotelian in the sense, in as much as it is based on a kind of substance metaphysics elaborated much better than Aristotle actually did. But that's another topic. And he says that Buddhism, on the other hand, is a philosophical system, if you want to elaborate it philosophically, and there are versions of that in Buddhism. Then it is a philosophy which is based on the Aristotelian accidental category. There are 9 accidents. You have substance and 9 accidents. And one of these accidents is relation, or al-idafa in Arabic. Because the Buddhists are sort of into analyzing. So they'll say, well, really, what is a table? You know, you've got square tables, and you've got round tables, and you've got vinyl tabletops and wooden tabletops, and some have 4 legs, and some have 3, and some just have like a big thing sticking out and a smaller circle underneath like you find in restaurants and so forth. And if you keep analyzing all this, ultimately we just have these relations and there's really nothing there. So the ultimate truth is shunyata. It is emptiness. And so Izutsu would say, because many people say, well, Buddhism is not really a theistic religion, it's an atheistic religion. Izutsu would have argued on the basis of this sort of schema that yes, you can say this, but this notion of shunyata as a kind of the ultimate truth coincides with the utterly non-conditioned stage of being. And it's similarly can be applied to the study, let's say, of non-dualistic Vedanta, the Advaita Vedanta, in terms of the notion of Brahman, how there is a Saguna Brahman and Nirguna Brahman, or Brahman with qualities and Brahman without qualities. So suffice it to say that this is a system which he saw could be used, and he illustrated this at great length in his, it's what, maybe 400 or 500 page book, Sufism and Taoism. So his reading of the Tao Te Ching is that Tao is a term for the absolute. And when it says, Tao ka Tao fei qing Tao, the Tao that can be named is the Tao that can be Taoed or spoken about is not the eternal Tao, and the name that can be named is not really the true name or the eternal name. It is this very problem that he wants to address. It is because you have the state of being utterly non-conditioned. This is how he would have put it. And to really understand what he's saying, you have to read the whole book, and he makes important. The conclusion of the book is only 3 pages, but it summarizes everything before. And so if the Tao is sort of this ultimate reality, and there is a kind of process of manifestation that takes place, which is exactly like what you find in Ibn al-Arabi. And for that, he quotes a famous passage from the Chuang-Tzu about wind flowing through a pipe, and it's considered in Japanese literature, in Chinese literature, according to what I read in Izutsu, to be the most beautiful description of the wind in Chinese literature. And so there's a similar idea in Ibn Arabi, which is called the breath of the All-Merciful. So it says, so God as such, in pronouncing the creative act, be and it is, he gives existence, or he existentiates the universe by what is called the breath of the All-Merciful. And because none of the letters of the Arabic alphabet or any other language or the phonemes of any language can only be articulated. And it's interesting, and we'll conclude here, that Izutsu saw his entire sort of pursuit and study of Oriental philosophy as an attempt to elaborate and give some sort of answer to what he called the problem of semantic articulation in mysticism. All right, this was a very high-end philosophical lecture for the last part in particular. So let us come down from those dizzying heights and enter the realm of question and answer. Thank you for listening. I believe you need this device.
Okay. All right, so we're going to transition to Dr. Stephen Hines' comments, and then we'll have a chance to ask our own questions.
Okay, thank you, Professor Grenier and Professor Ahmad, for this anyway, let me just hold this. Okay, I have the...
quickly if you want. I'll do it quickly.
Okay, thanks. Anyway, thank you, Professor Ahmad, for the very interesting and insightful lecture. We've had some discussions about Izutsu's work, both regarding Islam and Japan over the years, and I'm very happy to be able to be part of this, and I thank Professor Grenier and Professor Mesbahi for their behind-the-scenes organization of this event. So I'm holding up Professor Grenier's copy of the book that Professor Ahmad referred to, Sufism and Taoism, by Izutsu. That was this was a second publication of it. It had been out of print. It was originally, I think, published in the late 1960s, and this is from 1983. And this was a very elusive book because it was highly praised, but in those days before the internet, it was very hard to get hold of a copy of it. And I looked for this book for many, many years. This is the first time I've actually held it in my hands. I think you sent me a PDF file of it, and this was kind of a holy grail for me. Now let me explain a little bit about my background. I'm in the field of Japanese religion and culture, especially medieval Japan, and especially Zen Buddhism that the professor referred to. And I knew Izutsu's work entirely in the context of what he did on Japanese philosophy and poetry and Zen Buddhism. That's how I knew Izutsu. That's how remarkable this guy was. I mean, he had a completely solid reputation in this field, and meanwhile he's spending years at McGill University teaching Islam and in Tehran studying Islam, and he had this reputation. I didn't know anything about that for a long time. I had heard of this book because it connected the East and the West, or it connected Sufism and Islam on the one hand with Chinese and Asian philosophy on the other hand, but it was it was elusive, and I didn't know it. Let me tell one story about my involvement with Izutsu's philosophy of Japan and Japanese Zen Buddhism. And, if you know about Japanese poetry, it's very concise, right? Haikus are 17 syllables. The long form is 31 syllables. It's 5 lines. Zen Buddhism also asks these questions. What is the sound of one hand clapping? There's no answer. Does a dog have the Buddha nature? The answer is nothingness. So it's very cryptic, very concise, just a few words. And Izutsu coined the phrase in Japanese that in English translates into a plenitude of meaning. So this was an eye-opener for me, because he explained in that short phrase a lot of the meaning of Japanese philosophy, where they use very few words, less is more is another way of putting it, and they get all these manifold aspects of meaning out of a handful of words. And that was a great insight for me in trying to understand, interpret, and write my own research about Japanese philosophy. But I kept seeing in the bibliographies, Sufism and Taoism, where is that book? So I was teaching at other universities. I came to FIU in 1997. One of the first people I met was Professor Mesbahi, and we were trying to build up East Asian and Middle Eastern studies at FIU, and in those years, 25 years ago. And we were talking, and I said to Professor Mesbahi, did you ever hear of this guy Izutsu? I'm trying to get a hold of this book. And he said, Izutsu, my goodness, he's famous in Islamic studies. And we talked about it over the years, and then we're very fortunate to have the expert on how Izutsu appropriated and connected Japan and Islam. So it's great to be here. So we want to open up to student questions, but let me raise a couple of points I'd like to throw out that maybe the professor would comment now or at some other time. So you put a great picture about the intellectual historical context going back to the Iranist movement and how these intellectuals try to, grapple coming from biblical studies and trying to look at Islamic philosophy. So we're in the realm of comparative philosophy, East and West, so to speak. Is Islam Western or Eastern? That's of course a basic question. But the point is we're connecting different traditions. So the question that's always going to come up is somebody reading into the other tradition too much of their own viewpoint? Can they fully appreciate the other tradition? Or are they so immersed in the other tradition, then it affects the way they look at their own tradition? I'm not saying that is the case with Izutsu, but that's the question I'd like to throw out for possible clarification. So you said, Professor, and I think it was a very great comment that I'd like to explore some more. His book, Toward a Philosophy of Zen Buddhism, which is the book that I knew when I didn't know anything about his Islamic studies, but he reads Zen Buddhism with Islam in mind, or he has some idea from Islam in his appropriation, if I understood you correctly. So, could that be, just being devil's advocate a little bit, could that be a case of reading too much about the other tradition back to his own tradition? And reversing it, my understanding from what you've so creatively brought out here is that Izutsu is very highly respected. There's Persian translations that people are studying of his work on Islam, as Islam. And does he read some Japanese? Could he be reading a little too much Japanese flavor into his study of Islam? Just as devil's advocate, how do those two sides work out? Now, the neutral category that you brought up is Oriental philosophy, that maybe there's more connections than we realized. And maybe Izutsu is the one who has shown that underneath it all, underneath the apparent differences and all the stereotypes and categorizations that European and American scholars impose on the rest of the world, there is a fundamental underlying connection that we could label Oriental philosophy, where Sufism and Taoism and Zen Buddhism and maybe also Hinduism and these mystical meditative traditions that have such a great articulation through philosophy and poetry over the centuries, have more in common. And so Izutsu was somebody who pointed it out, and now we need some decades later to retake up the challenge that he has put out for us. So again, thank you, and I look forward to questions from the audience.